Welcome everybody. Thanks for coming in over lunch. Let's see what we can do about distributed systems and distributed teams, and I will stress or focus on the teams aspect here. So maybe I can see you. Who is still working from home? Okay, I want to say the majority. Who is in the office? Who is moving back to the office? And you can tell me privately afterwards if you don't want to, or if you, because I know a lot of people who are like supposed to go back to the office and they're like, nah, I kind of like home office by now. And I'll try to show you why this might be a good idea or bad idea or what I think about it. Depending on where you are standing on this topic, for some people, the office and an open space plan is not such a great idea as you can see here. Maybe you also have seen this great invention. I always call it the horsey blinder, so you don't see left and right, and it also has headphones built in, so you don't notice even your colleagues. For other people, working from home is very weird. So, for example, this kid was asked by its teacher, what are your parents doing? And then the answer is basically they talk to their computer and drink coffee at home. So that can also be kind of like the look of home office, which is, I don't think, the reality, but let's see what's in there. So I work for Elastic, the company behind Elasticsearch and other products. We have been distributed from the start as a company. So I have been working from home for 6 years. So it's less weird for me and kind of like the normal way. And then when people were kind of like very confused or surprised when COVID hit that, oh, you can do everything from home, we were like, we told you so, but it's not without friction or problems. Let's see what we can do here. So Elastic by now, I think, is like 2,700 people or something like that. So it also works for larger groups and environments where lots of people are working from home. We do cover lots of languages, time zones. We have a couple of offices, but those are mostly like marketing and sales, like the noisy people. And then no engineers go there anyway. So engineering is pretty much at home. And Elastic, for example, was distributed by design. So not just our systems are distributed by design, but also the company. So we have these 4 were the 4 founders, and not even they were in the same city. So from the very first day, it was clear that everything had to be in writing or a call, but it couldn't just be discussed over coffee. And having it from the start is actually making it a lot simpler, because then everybody's kind of used to this is the way to go. Implementing it later on, I think, is much harder than having that structure from the start. We are quite particular about calling it distributed and not remote, because remote for us always would mean you have like a central hub where lots of people are, and then you have these remote people. And that, I think, can be very tricky, because then oftentimes in that central place over coffee or whatever, decisions are being made and those remote are being cut off. So I think that is tricky. If everybody is distributed, there is no chance to accidentally discuss something over coffee. It's not even that people mean it in a bad way or do it on purpose, but it just happens that you bump into somebody over coffee and you discuss something, and then you're saying like, oh, this is a great decision, or that's a great idea, let's do that. And 3 weeks later, the remote people are like, what happened here? Like, why are we doing this? And then they were like, ah, yeah, by the way, we had this discussion over coffee where you couldn't participate and you don't know anything about it. So that can be a bit of a tricky situation. If everybody is distributed and everything is in a call or in writing, then nobody is cut off from that information stream. So that is one of the things that I think are sometimes a bit tricky. We have something we call X-School, which is the onboarding, which in the old days looked something like this. So this was like 2 months or so of people joining the company, and we put everybody together. By now, we kind of do the same thing still virtually, and then we take a picture of everybody on Zoom, and then you have the Zoom tile, but it's not as much fun. And I also think that the onboarding in person is like great for motivation and building your network, and it's really hard to replicate that virtually. Our colleagues tried. I'm not convinced. I think this should be in person if you're a distributed company. We also have other concepts, like we call it always on. It's like one product, like Elasticsearch, has a Zoom stream that is always on and running, and whoever wants to can jump on that channel and then talk to other people. And some just are there silently and you can see them work because that's what they like to do. And others then start chatting. which is slightly weird. Like when I joined in the first day and it was like, come on, Aeon, and I didn't know what Aeon was at first until somebody explained this always on concept. And then it's kind of like, for some people like me, I feel slightly stressed if I'm on the video stream and then you're sitting there and then like, I don't know, don't pick your nose, don't look weird, sit straight, whatever. Others really enjoy to kind of like just feel like other people are also working and they are not totally alone in their work environment. But it's optional, so you can figure out what works for you. We also have a lot of cross-team time stuff. So, for example, we have a bug pool where we try to discuss bugs that came out over in the last week. We have something called Fix It Friday to go through open GitHub issues together, just to make it a bit more collaborative and also like help move decisions forward when people are synchronously working on a call, rather than having everything async as a GitHub issue or pull request. We also do release parties, but I must admit the release parties are slightly less fun at home. It might look something like this. So this was one of our product managers for Kibana, as you might guess. But drinking at home also has a bad reputation. So you probably don't want to overdo that. And it's also, maybe for the company, it's much more efficient because we say like, oh, there's a big release at 6 p.m., whatever time, we all get together on a Zoom call, and then people for 5 minutes are like, yeah, this is great. And 5 minutes later, everybody is working again. So for the company, it might actually be a win, and you don't destroy the office in those parties. Yeah. We are not very strict on processes. So sometimes people are like, oh, do you do extreme programming, agile, whatever? And we are very much like, whatever works for the team, you figure it out, you're adults, you make the right thing out of that. So we don't have like a very strict process of this is how stuff has to work in a distributed company. It's more like really up to the team. Some do stand-ups. If you have lots of time zones, stand-ups are kind of tricky because there is no morning, so there is no morning stand-up concept. Also, daily might be too complex and you only do it 2 times or 3 times a week. Other teams don't have anything like that. For example, my team only has emails. We send a weekly status email, grouped together by region basically, and just send that. And we do have company all hands, which used to be in person. Right now they are still virtual. And personally, I want to say like, in person is great, though it's craziness. Virtual is a bit of a drag because you can try to do all things virtually, but some things you cannot replace in person. I think work is fine to do in a distributed company. Getting together and kind of like forming those bonds is very hard if you're not in person together. We do have something called the source code, and that's not the source code that you can download and use. It's kind of like the source code of the company. What we use to kind of like hold this together, we call it home dinner, that most of us, not necessarily me if I go to a lot of events, but most people are at home and then can join dinner with their families, and that's for many people important. And everybody has to figure out their work-life balance, what works for them and their family. We call it space time, where you get some time off to work on projects that you wouldn't have time for otherwise, just to set that aside explicitly. And then we like the phrase, it depends. And it depends is really, there is no single answer for either solutions in the product or working as a person or as a team, but you need to figure out what works for that situation and for you. And then we call it as you are. You can have whatever haircut, dress as long as you're dressed, etc., whatever works for you. There are, however, definitely downsides to working in a distributed company. The number one thing I think that everybody will agree to is that time zones, if you're not in a single time zone or close enough time zones, are a major pain. So I have a weekly call, for example, with a colleague in Australia, multiple colleagues in the US, and me in Europe, which is at 11:30 p.m. every Wednesday for me, which is fine since I'm kind of like a late person, but it's just the problem that for the Australian, it's 7 a.m. in the morning, and for me, it's 11 p.m. And that's really the only time we can all get together. And it is a bit kind of like a tricky situation if that is not your time of the day. You can, of course, always have a delegate to take over for you and speak for you, but sometimes it's much easier to make those decisions if you're there. So if you want to move stuff forward, you sometimes need to suffer a bit through that time zone pain, I'm afraid. The other thing that can happen is that communication can totally fail. We all know how Twitter works. Like, people who would be kind of reasonable if they would talk in person with each other, it totally derails on Twitter very quickly. The same can kind of happen in a company when you kind of like misunderstand or you don't get the cue from the body language and everything, and then stuff gets heated totally unnecessarily. For us, what has worked very well was that you see things are not going the way they should, and then you hop on a Zoom call, because then just seeing the other one and talking to each other often works much better than writing a long email and then the other person reading the long email, misinterpreting something, and then sending a heated email back. That doesn't lead anywhere normally. So asynchronous communication and writing is great to get started with and to put decisions together. If you have an argument, it's probably not the best way. Otherwise, you might end up like the typical Twitter discussion. The other thing that we notice is that cultures are different, and what might be a great joke in France might be kind of offensive in the US or totally misunderstood. So we always try to tame it down. You should have empathy for the other side and try to understand their position. But it is sometimes tricky if something gets lost in translation or if something is just like culturally confusing for others. The one thing that sometimes can be a bit of a pain, at least for us, is that the decisions can drag. So if everybody is in one place and one time zone and you have like a meeting at 9 a.m. and then you lock everybody in a conference room and say basically you can only go for lunch once you have made that decision. And once people get hungry enough, they will probably come to an agreement and move on. In a distributed environment, this is much trickier because for some person it's very early and for others it's very late. And then they will be like, oh, I need to go pick up my kids. And you can say like, well, you have to let your kids sit at school because then childcare will show up and it's not helping anybody. So sometimes it's just like, okay, we can't decide that today, we need to postpone and we need to move on. And then you say like, oh, we'll do another call next week. And then it's kind of like 1 week of buffer where nothing happens. So it's sometimes easier to get everybody together in person to make a decision rather than having a 30-minute or 45-minute or whatever Zoom call, and then it kind of like needs another Zoom call and another Zoom call. Also, what I find very dragging often is like if you're in a Zoom call and people don't know each other and you do an introduction round, over Zoom, that's kind of like a very painful process in my opinion, and sucks up a lot of time. And you really cannot replace in-person. So even if you're a fully distributed company, you want some in-person time just to have that connection, do some more fun activity. I always feel like it's a bit forced in a virtual environment. And I know some people love this, like, oh, we have coffee hour, and our company does that as well. It's like you drink coffee and then you chat about random topics. And to me, it always feels kind of forced. Having a real coffee in person with somebody and chatting feels much more natural and develops nicely for me. Whereas like now you have a 25-minute slot where you drink coffee and need to chat to have that social aspect covered. Feels more like a to-do checkbox that you need to tick. And I'm personally not a big fan. So I think the distributed environment works great for getting stuff done and working. But all of the other stuff feels kind of like complicated. How does a day look like? So for example, since we are fully distributed and we have all the time zones, what we have is, so I'm more on the crazy side. I like crazy, so I often work until 6 a.m. in the morning. And the next day or something like that, I might have to catch a 7 a.m. flight. So I'm fine with that. I always am slightly amused when people say like, oh, there is summertime coming and there's a 1 hour time change and that's like a mini jet lag. And I'm like, I'll do 5 hours from one day to the next and it's just like normal for me, but I might just be crazy. A lot of my colleagues use it to be flexible. For example, they bring their kids to school in the morning and then they might work in a coffee place somewhere there and then they might take them home, have lunch, do some more work and probably have some more work time in the evening. So it's really broken up, like it's not 8 hours of work and that's kind of like blocked and you cannot do anything else. But they have like smaller 2 or 3 hour chunks where they do stuff. Some other colleagues like a very traditional way. So they get up, they do their work, they're done, they move on. So whatever works for you, we don't really care normally, as long as you do your stuff and you show up to the important meetings if you can, then that's fine. You just need to figure it out. And I think that's part of the problem is, especially if you want to hire more junior people, that for them it's very hard to figure out what is right and what is wrong and what am I supposed to do. For them, more rigorous structure is much easier to follow. Also, if you have like 10 colleagues sitting in the office and you can just copy basically what they're doing and replicate their things, then it might be easier. So I think that that is one of the major downsides of a distributed company. We often get asked, like, what do we use in terms of tooling, which is pretty standard. I don't think there will be any surprises here. We use too much Slack and too much Zoom. It's still better than any Google Meet, whatever stuff, like that would drive me crazy, or WebEx or whatever. But we do a lot of those. Though if we can, we will try to have everything asynchronous, because it's just much easier with different time zones, or you're away from your computer. And synchronous is great in the moment to move something forward. But it's kind of like intense as well, especially for distributed teams. So if we can, for us, most of the things are GitHub, issues, pull requests, or email lists. Everything we try to do is like an email list, so you can easily forward it later on, or people can join and also leave if it's not the right information for them. So email lists for us are kind of like the go-to place, because it's very much self-service. You can go or join all the information that you need, but you can also leave if it's not relevant anymore. And emails are very good in terms of filtering and sorting and automatically doing something with that. So email is, I think, one of the underestimated or underused tools there. Now, the question that I always get at the end is like, show me the numbers that distributed teams work so much better. And I could make up some number, but I think Dilbert always says it best, where you see, I could make up any random number here, but it's not going to mean much. But in my opinion, 87 of the right studies or whatever show that work from home is better. And probably for you, it could be totally the opposite. So to wrap up, who still wants to work from an office? I'm just curious. Okay, I think that's like 20% or so, 30. Who wants to work from home? Okay, it's almost the same. Who is being forced into one way or another and you don't want to go there? Okay, luckily that's very few. Good. As long as everybody happy, I think that makes most sense. We have like 2 minutes left if you have any questions. Also, if you want stickers, I have a couple of stickers there. Just take them. I'll leave them afterwards, so take whatever you want. Any questions? It's very hard to see. I'll move out of the light.
Hi, just a question about juniors, because I work for Red Hat and we work remotely, but my experience when there is a new junior, especially if it's just a graduate, it's not that simple to find him, let's say, to define an environment that fit well for him to be followed. Don't feel himself like just alone, that, okay, we just sync up after 1 week. So is there like a process that you define it? Is there like a specific way? So
what we have done is we have, in a very small number, we call it the Elastic Red program, where we have, the entire company only took on 4 graduates this year for engineering, and we made sure they have 2 people managing them or being their contacts. So you need a very high ratio of like taking care of somebody and checking in probably every day. I think it's a recipe for disaster to say like, well, we hired you, good luck, figure this out, we'll see you in a week or a month. I think that will not work for anybody. That's why historically we have also been hiring mostly on the more senior side, which I think is the same pretty much for all the distributed companies, especially if you have like, oh, you have a good name and reputation and then you just pick like whatever you can from the seniors, but that's not really an option for many other companies, which is a bit unfortunate, and I don't want to say it gives distributed work a bad name, but I think that is one of the trickiest aspects, yes. And I think that being really present for juniors and taking them on by the hand, basically, is sometimes required. Because in the office, you would see like somebody's just sitting there and staring at the screen and nothing is happening. And then you can tap them on the shoulder and say like, do you need anything? Should we walk you through this? Or what are you even trying to do? And it's not just juniors. It can also be like people who are not great at working in a remote environment. They might also just be stuck. And then you don't notice for a week. And you need to fix that pretty quickly because otherwise this is not going to work out, I think, for the company. But that's a well-known thing. I'm afraid I'm out of time. If you have any more questions, just find me. I'm here for the rest of the day. Thanks a lot.